This month's artist was chosen by viewers via the Deep Discog Dive decision. I'll be picking next month, but feel free to suggest artists in the comments to cover. And check out the Spotify playlist in the description. It has all the songs from this video and more. Enjoy! Welcome back to the Deep Discog Dive. Oh, hey, how's it going? I'm busy writing the first musical DDD. They say that talking about music is like dancing about architecture, so why not sing about music and build skyscrapers that can do pirouettes? Turns out that second one is a massive safety hazard, so I'll just forget about the couple million I invested in that. Today, we're talking about Pink Floyd. Let's dive in. Let's take it back to London in the early 1960s. Three architecture students, Roger Waters, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright, started playing music in their free time. Their original name was Sigma 6, but over the next 3 years, they would see a whole bunch of name changes, including Leonard's Lodgers, the Megadeths, and the T-Set. While they were called the T-Set in 1964, they added Roger's childhood friend, Syd Barrett. He would eventually become their lead guitarist the following year. During that same year, Syd suggested another name change to the Pink Floyd sound. The change came about because they were at a gig that just so happened to have another band called the T-Set. The group's profile grew steadily in 1966. They got two managers, Andrew King and Peter Jenner. They became regulars at venues like the Countdown Club and UFO Club. Their set lists moved away from R&B covers and more towards Syd Barrett's own songs. By 1967, the Pink Floyd, now a whole word lighter, signed with EMI. Their first two singles with EMI, Arnold Lane and See Emily Play, both reached the top 20 of the UK charts. The stage had been set for their first album. The same year as their deal with EMI and their first singles, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn was released in August 1967. For reasons that'll be clear in a bit, Piper is kind of singular in the Pink Floyd's discography. It's the album most influenced by psych rock, mainly because of Syd Barrett's artistic control over the group. It's also whimsical, really whimsical. Considering the albums this band would go on to do, I was a bit shocked to hear sprightly songs about a gnome named Grimble Gromble, childhood fairy tales, ancient Chinese texts, existential scarecrows, and the music behind it has one heck of a surrealist slant, often pulling in Baroque orchestration and odd production techniques. Sure, later albums might be more consistent and in line with the sound the band was known for, but did those albums have bike?
I'll give you anything, everything, if you want thing.
Ooh, yeah, me, I want thing. Even with the psych rock leaning, there are tracks here that signal where the band will go from here, specifically the spaced out instrumentals Astronomy Domine and Interstellar Overdrive. When it comes to debut albums, they sure don't get as eccentric as Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and though its eccentricity makes it an outlier in the group's history, it's still a good album. Recording for a new album began almost immediately after Piper's release, but as work progressed, the band faced a difficult decision. In part due to the band's sudden explosion in popularity, and in part due to his acid and LSD usage, Syd Barrett's mental health had slowly been getting worse. In fact, several of the band's shows promoting Piper were cancelled because Syd was unable to play. And for the shows they did play, Syd came off as detached. The other bandmates tried to help him, but after a certain point, they realized something needed to change. In late December of '67, David Gilmour was added as a new guitarist, and by March of the next year, Syd Barrett was officially out of Pink Floyd. Syd would have a few credits on the band's second album and would go on to release 2 solo albums before stepping out of the public spotlight in the mid-70s. This might be where Syd left Pink Floyd, but I want to make clear, not only would he go on to be an inspiration for a whole host of artists, but his character and his absence would be major influences on Pink Floyd going forward. The band's two managers also left with Syd, so Steve O'Rourke came in to replace them to manage the band from here on out. And to top it all off, they took Sean Parker's famous advice.
Drop the.
Pink Floyd's second album, A Saucerful of Secrets, was released in June 1968. As you might imagine from its saucy title, this was the band's first foray into space rock. I'm a big fan of the 3-part opener, Let There Be More Light. As an intro track, it exemplifies the longer songwriting the band would become known for. Speaking of longer songs, we also have the band dipping their toes into the long-form ambient experimentation pool with songs like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the title track. Elsewhere on the album, there are flickers of what Pink Floyd could become that were bogged down by strange production decisions. The vocal harmonies on Corporal Clegg are gorgeous. If only there were kazoos. Oh, thank Christ. Seesaw was initially titled The Most Boring Song I've Ever Heard, Bar 2, so take that for what you will. But closing things out is Jughead Blues, one of the last Pink Floyd songs written by Syd Barrett. Also, this actually means this is the only album of Pink Floyd's to have all 5 main members on it. A Salvation Army band comes in halfway through, only to be cut off abruptly to have Syd muse about personal alienation. A pretty perfect way to end both the album and his time with the band. If anything, Saucerful is noteworthy for the firsts it represented for the band. It was the first album that was primarily overseen by Roger Waters. It was their first album with the artwork designed by British art group Hipgnosis, who would do the covers for the band's main albums up to 1977, and it was the album that first showed where the band would go sonically for the next 5 years or so. A lot of Saucerful of Secrets' more atmospheric tracks could almost soundtrack a sci-fi movie, so it's fitting that Pink Floyd's next album would be a movie soundtrack. The band were contacted by director Barbet Schroeder, most known for art house and thriller films. He invited Pink Floyd to make the soundtrack for an upcoming film of his, which the band were pretty pumped to do. They figured if music didn't work out, they could always soundtrack Boss Baby. About a year after Saucerful, More was released in June 1969. I don't have much to say about More. It's nothing terrible, but it just doesn't reach the same memorable heights that the last 2 records do. But there are still some nice songs on here. Green is the Color is a sweet acoustic ditty that could pass as a mid-period Beatles track, and it's followed by fan favorite Cymbeline. Ibiza Bar and the Nile Song are 2 of the hardest sounding songs from the band's early years, and A Spanish Piece is definitely a Spanish piece. More definitely has some of Pink Floyd's more adventurous tracks from this era, but it's not imperative that you go through the whole album to find them. Between albums, Pink Floyd played a set with Frank Zappa, and everyone had a time. The band's next album followed shortly after More. Ummagumma was released in November 1969. This one was Pink Floyd's first double LP, and truly, Ummagumma is 2 different albums. The first side is a live album, 2 tracks from A Saucerful of Secrets, 1 from Piper, and fan favorite Careful with That Axe Eugene. That last one is my favorite track from this side. The second side is where things get weird. Essentially, each band member made a singular piece with no input from any other member, and the results are interesting. I like the piano throughout Richard Wright's Sisyphus, particularly in part 2, but I'd be lying if I said I remembered anything else from his 4-part suite. Waters' contributions are the acoustic ballad Grantchester Meadows and the musique concrète piece, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. The latter had Waters warping and speeding up various sounds, and had him donning a Scottish accent in the second half. I'm only a little bit reminded of the similar piece, Crazy Frog's Crazy Sounds. Nick Mason's piece is the Grand Vizier's Garden Party, complete with a 7-minute long drum solo. David Gilmour's The Narrow Way Suite is probably the best on here, if only because it's the one that feels most like a fully conceived piece of music. Sales for Ummagumma were strong at the time, but both Waters and Gilmour have expressed disdain for the album in the years since. Me personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. The first half has some great live cuts, the second deserves some recognition for what it showed in each band member. Does that mean I'm gonna return to it much? Probably not. But it's still a neat record, albeit more in concept than execution. The band did some more soundtrack work after Ummagumma, this time just a few songs for the 1970 film Zabriskie Point. Afterwards, they went back into Abbey Road to work on Atom Heart Mother, which released in October 1970. This has a similar structure to Ummagumma. The first half is the titular suite, with part names like Breast Milky, Funky Dung, and Mind Your Throats Please. Because of Abbey Road's 8-track tape machine and EMI's own restrictions, Roger and Nick had to record the bass and drums for this 23-minute long song in one go. But even with that working against the band, I liked this piece, especially the greater emphasis on brass instrumentation, which fits the gang's music well. When we talk about Pink Floyd's early psychedelic jam band side, Atom Heart Mother is certainly one of the band's finer moments. The second half, also like Ummagumma, features solo compositions from the 4 bandmates. Roger and David's contributions definitely showed a clear improvement in songwriting over their Ummagumma cuts, but then you have Nick Mason's track, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which has the band doing musique concrète under one of their roadies describing what he had for breakfast. Great. Overall, Atom Heart Mother is one of the better albums from Pink Floyd's early days, though with these post-Syd albums, I keep feeling like the whole is less than the sum of its parts. Like, the elements of greatness are there, but the glue to keep them together hasn't been squeezed out of the crusty Elmer's bottle of fate just yet. Pink Floyd Floyd toured for a good part of both 1970 and 1971. If you want to hear a great performance from this period, check out the Meddle performance from the BBC archives. After touring, they spent the majority of 1971 working on a new album. On engineering duties this time was John Leckie, whose name might be familiar to you. Among a whole bunch of other credits, he would go on to produce Radiohead's The Bends. The recording process this time was definitely more scattershot. The band didn't have a clear focus, instead choosing to experiment with songwriting practices. Helping their process, though, was the move partway through recording from Abbey Road to Air Studios, which had a 16-track tape machine. So not only could they record more, but they could also record songs in pieces, unlike what they had to do with Adam Hart Mother. The result of their studio meddling was Meddle, released in October 1971. To start, I really like One of These Days as an opener, with the ostinato in the bass, organ keys, and the bluesy jam going for the last 2 minutes. Fearless is another good cut. I like that ascending guitar hook, and the fade-in of a crowd singing You'll Never Walk Alone is an oddly compelling touch. I even like Saint-Tropez, a sort of tropical jazz ballad. It feels like the band is starting to nail these strange genre Seamus, what are you doing out of your cage? But Meddle is often remembered not because of those tracks, but because of its closer, Echoes.
Overhead, the albatross hangs motionless upon the air.
This is not to dismiss the rest of Meddle in the past 5 albums, but Echoes is the point where Pink Floyd became the Pink Floyd you know. Each section, from the opening radar noises to that quality descending riff, to the blues section that sounds straight off the best Rolling Stones record you never heard, to the empty cavernous ambience mounting into a slow build, then back into the main section with that descending riff, Echoes is the closest thing we have to a definitive turning point where the band's experimentation coalesced into something truly potent, as opposed to experimental noodling. If anything, it's a bummer that Echoes just overshadows the rest of the album. It's like when your parents kept choosing one kid as their favorite over the rest of you, except one of them does actually suck. Meddle is the first record in my chronological Pink Floyd escapade that truly displayed the greatness this band were capable of. And the next record would be the one that broke all preconceptions of what Pink Floyd could accomplish. Another movie soundtrack. Pink Floyd toured again soon after Meddle came out. They also began working on another album, something about a moon or something. I don't know, I don't listen to music. But as all that was going on, they were contacted again by Barbet Schroeder to provide a soundtrack for his film, La Vallée. Said soundtrack was eventually released on its own as Obscured by Clouds in June 1972. I really don't have much to say about this one. It's alright. The 2 tracks I'd recommend you check out are the single Free For and What's the Deal. The latter is one of David Gilmour's better compositions from this era. Otherwise, it's the same deal as More, an interesting diversion, but not an essential listen. Alright, what's this about a moon? A few months after Obscured by Clouds, the band released Live at Pompeii, a performance they did to an empty Pompeii amphitheater. A pretty excellent live show with a great set list, worth checking out if you're a fan of Pink Floyd in any capacity. By the film's release, though, the gang were already head deep into the making of their next album. The initial concept was lunacy and what makes people mad, in part inspired by what they went through with Syd Barrett. Unlike past records, Pink Floyd toured the entire album before committing it to tape. Not only did it allow the band to tweak and tinker the material, but said material was already getting rave reviews from anyone who saw it. They eventually went into Abbey Road to record, with engineering handled by Alan Parsons. In March of 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon was released.
Wait, for those of you who have Dark Side of the Moon, press play now.
And just like that, Pink Floyd shot themselves into the absolute stratosphere of rock. Critics loved this thing, audiences loved this thing. It was as if Pink Floyd gave birth to all of progressive rock from this one album. Plus, in the US, the new head of Capitol Records felt bad that they didn't promote Meddle that much, so they went all out in promoting this new one. They finally started seeing some real success in the States. Rapturous praise and ridiculous sales figures, all earned by an album that is very good, Okay. Look, I am not about to drop a galactic brain take and say Dark Side of the Moon is bad, actually. Dark Side of the Moon is good. Quite good. Easily the most immediately accessible project the band had made up to this point, and there are plenty of great moments to be heard. The Great Gig in the Sky, for example, has a stunning guest vocal from Claire Torrey. She actually sued EMI in 2004 to get a co-writing credit as opposed to just a performing credit, and all pressings of this album after 2005 have her listed as a writer. Money will probably be used in music classrooms as the de facto example of a song in 7/4 until the end of time. 7/4, not even once. But it's got a great hook which helped make it the band's first real hit in the US. Time is another great highlight, though I keep thinking that David Gilmour says adulting at one point, but he actually says a dull day. But man, if the first half of this album is good, then the second half is also good. I said it before, this is a good album. I love the dynamic contrast between the verses and the choruses on Us and Them, plus how those vocal harmonies just melt together so beautifully, topped off with a glorious sax solo. And let's not forget the closing pair of Brain Damage and Eclipse. Brain Damage might have the most cathartic title drop in all of music. And Eclipse, the chord progression in the organ with the added vocal layers as the song goes on, a fantastic closer. Now, I recognize that I've been saying a lot of positive things about this album, but I'll qualify it. In my opinion, what takes a good or great album to an all-time personal classic is an intangible essence, something about it that just speaks to you and your life, which makes the precious album a core part of your musical personality. Clearly, Dark Side of the Moon nails that essence for so many, and there are moments on this that I adore, but that extra something something just isn't there for me. This is totally just a personal thing though. I am not saying that thing bad because me no thing like. So yeah, I'm not fawning over Dark Side, but also who cares? Like, my opinion is not going to suddenly turn the cultural tide on Dark Side of the Moon. This record has achieved a kind of cultural ubiquity that has only been equaled by, what, 4 other albums ever? It is a landmark touchstone of an album, one that has brought joy and meaning to all sorts of folks. So many see this as perfect. I see it as very good. We have now officially entered Pink Floyd's sicko period. Dark Side of the Moon was the most critically acclaimed record Pink Floyd had released so far, and it launched them into a new echelon of fame. But with that came new scrutiny and stress, which would follow them into their next album. The gang came back to Abbey Road for the first half of 1975, and the sessions this time around were much more strenuous than Dark Side. Everyone was just kind of pissed at each other for different reasons, plus they were battling the pressure that naturally comes when you've made every college freshman's favorite poster. Despite all that, the band persevered to release Wish You Were Here in September 1975. Believe it or not, critics initially weren't a fan of this one, saying it was devoid of passion and imagination. So is the phrase, I love this album, but I'm still gonna say it. Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar are the band's first explicit disses against the music industry. I love Gilmour's yelling on the former, set against these piercing synths that sound like they're impaling you. The latter is apparently a continuation of the song Money, with a greedy executive demanding more of the band following Dark Side's success. And the title track is just a really sweet ballad that many have interpreted as a tribute to Syd Barrett. Though, if we're gonna talk about tributes to Syd, we have to talk about this album's main event, Shine On, You Crazy Diamond. As a singular 9-part suite, Shine On You Crazy Diamond might be the greatest thing Pink Floyd ever did. What makes it special to me is that it feels like a dedication to a person, which, yeah, that's obvious, but I mean a full person. Your experiences with them, the great times you had, the low points where they frustrated you, their strengths, their flaws, and the cumulative looking back on all the time you shared together. There are so many great aspects to it. That 4-note motif in the opening, so perfectly evoking a heartsick nostalgia, the triumphant sing-along chorus, that sick meter change in the middle of the sax solo. the synth solo kicking off part 6, a funk breakdown in part 8, and the callback to the melody from See Emily Play in part 9. An all-out classic and a remarkable showcase in how far Pink Floyd had come since Sid's departure. It's also worth mentioning now a certain event that happened while they were mixing Shine On. On the last day of mixing, a man with a shaved head and eyebrows came in without saying a word. At first, nobody paid this guy any mind, but after some time and light conversation, they realized it was Syd Barrett. From all accounts, it was a very surreal and emotional experience, and it would also be the last time that most of Pink Floyd saw Syd. It's kind of perfect that this story happened during what may be the most humanistic album the band has made thus far, and what is my favorite Pink Floyd album so far. The same year as Wish You Were Here, the band bought a bunch of church halls in London with the intent of turning them into a full recording studio. The sessions for this next album definitely showed Roger Waters taking more of a lead in the songwriting. Aside from one credit to Gilmour, Waters wrote every song. The band's 10th album, Animals, was released in January 1977. Animals is something that a Pink Floyd album hasn't been so far. It's angry. I mean, the last album had songs that were directly targeted at some entity, the music industry, but they weren't mad in the same way that a lot of the songs on Animals are. More specifically, the concept of the album is based on George Orwell's Animal Farm, though while that book was more about Stalin-era communism, Animals is a critique of capitalism. You can kind of get that vibe from the album cover depicting Battersea Power Station, which was actually turned into shopping centers and condos in the late 2010s. Don't you love metaphors? Me neither. Also, shout out to The Flying Pig, loved its performance in Children of Men. Like Wish You Were Here, Animals is only 5 tracks, though in practice it's really 3 main songs: Dogs, Pigs, 3 different ones, and Sheep. Dogs is probably the best representation of the album's ethos. Pigs, 3 different ones, has Roger on vocals as he decries those who hoard wealth and force those underneath to fight for scraps. It also has a talk box, so it's automatically a good song. To be honest though, Sheep is probably my favorite out of the 3. I love the crashing synths and guitars in the verses, the 2 synth-led breakdowns, and all those guitars in the last 2 minutes are so sick. Remember that guy who said this album was only 3 main songs? That guy was a dummy, because the 2 different versions of Pigs on the Wing that bookend this album are quite lovely, and help to make this album not feel as despondent as it could have been. Overall, Animals is another home run for the band, not only expanding musically on the album before, but incorporating more topical and timely lyrical themes. I wonder if they'll continue on that road. Just a heads up that for this album, we're going to be getting into some more adult-oriented topics. If you'd rather not hear about these topics, feel free to skip to the next album. In support of Animals, Pink Floyd went out on their first ever stadium tour, and everyone kinda hated it.
Oh, for f***'s sake, stop letting off fireworks and shouting and screaming. I'm trying to sing a song.
Roger Waters especially, he hated the distracted crowds, he hated the noise from the audience, he hated it so much that he began envisioning the band and the audience separated by a wall. That said, if you want to check out a live show from this era, there's a recording from Oakland where they do Animals and Wish You Were Here in full, definitely worth checking out. After the tour, the gang either made solo albums or worked on other bands' albums. Most notably was David Gilmour helping a young songwriter named Kate Bush with her first album. But amidst all that, Roger got to writing. In 1978, Roger presented 2 concepts for a new album to the band, and they picked the one then titled Bricks in the Wall. The process from there can only be described as a wee bit hellish. First, to help manage the project, producer Bob Ezrin was brought in. The relationship between him and Waters was contentious as all heck, with the 2 men's strong personalities creating a tense environment. It also didn't help that in an attempt to get money for this new album, the band lost just a few £1,000,000 in high-risk investments. The fallout led to the band having to live outside of the UK for a whole year in order to avoid high tax rates and bankruptcy. The most severe result of this tension, though, was the worsening relationship between Waters and Richard Wright. And due to that and a variety of other personal factors, Wright left Pink Floyd shortly before this new album was done. So, with all that working against them, what did Pink Floyd give us this time? They gave us a rock opera, The Wall, released in November 1979. Oh boy, let's do this. First, let's tackle the plot of The Wall. The story follows a rock star named Pink and the bricks that construct the emotional wall around him. His father's death in World War II, his mother raising him by herself, teachers abusing him in school, his wife becoming distant and having an affair, etc. As he becomes isolated from the world, he locks himself in a hotel room and passes out from drugs. Eventually, Pink's manager finds him and, in order to get him out for a show, decides to counteract the drugs with more drugs. As he is carried out onto the stage, Pink then imagines himself as a fascist leader holding a rally, which then turns into a spree of hate crimes. It's here where Pink snaps out of his delusions. Now feeling tremendous guilt, he puts himself on figurative trial and ultimately tears down his emotional wall. Next, let's acknowledge, The Wall is a lot. It's so much a lot that the album inspired a full arena tour, a 1982 film adaptation, a 2016 opera, and a handful of full album performances by Waters in the years since. Also, if you're curious, like I was, why those performances are attributed to Waters specifically and not the rest of Pink Floyd, we'll get to that. It is the culmination of the lyrical through lines that have appeared in the past few Pink Floyd albums, and it's wrapped in a narrative that is deeply personal and occasionally uncomfortable. At least on a thematic level, this is basically a Roger Waters solo album. So if you're listening to The Wall for the first time, you might be sort of blown away by the sheer existence of it all. But after listening and taking time to think, does The Wall still stand up? Yeah, it's pretty good. I think, in lesser hands, this project could have easily veered into "Gorsh, we really do be living in a society, though" territory. But I'll remind you that Pink Floyd were still in their sicko period, and thus, most of The Wall continues the level of quality from the past three albums. Most crucially, the heart of the album lies in Pink's trauma over his father dying and the childhood he effectively lost. And if those elements weren't there, this whole project could have fallen apart so quickly. In the Flesh ? Is an excellent opener, not only establishing the epic feel of the album, but also two musical motifs that you'll hear later on. I love the lumbering sparseness of Another Brick in the Wall Part 1, into Happiest Days of Our Lives with a dash of musique concrète, then into the well-known single Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, a faux disco jam about the oppression and abuse of Waters' education. Mother and Goodbye Blue Sky are really tender ballads that hit especially hard when paired with visuals, but I'll get to those in a sec. I will say though, the album's pacing starts to noticeably slow in the middle. The songs from Empty Spaces to Bring the Boys Back Home are fine in the context of the album and the story they tell, but most of them don't really stand on their own as individual songs. Except for Hey You, that's a great song. But thankfully, the last third of this album is pretty spectacular. David Gilmour didn't have many writing credits on The Wall, but one of them was Comfortably Numb, so I think he came away with a W. I adore this song. It has one of the best choruses of any Pink Floyd song and one of Gilmour's best vocal performances. From there, In the Flesh, No Question Mark depicts the fascist hallucination while bringing back the motifs of In the Flesh ? Run Like Hell and Waiting for the Worms make for one hell of a combo, despite being soundtracks for the hate crime section of hallucinated fascism. The rest of the album after that is fine. Worth highlighting is The Trial, having Waters vocalize different parts of Pink's psyche against an orchestra. Also, along with the album, I checked out the film version for this video. It's directed by Alan Parker, written by Roger Waters, with animation by Gerald Scarfe. Also, the actor playing Pink, Bob Geldof, was one of the organizers of the original Live Aid concert. I'll say this, the movie is the most extreme version of The Wall you can engage with. The high points of the album are made that much more potent when accompanied by dramatizations of Pink's dad dying, the Blitz, Pink doing a fascism, seeing Pink destroy his hotel room and throw his TV out the window Tommy Wiseau style. But like the album, the film does sag in the middle. Oh, and while Scarfe's animation is great for the most part, the caricatures in the trial scene reminded me of
Join me, Link, and I will make your face the greatest in Korodai, or else you will die.
Like, it's not just me, right? But still, if you're interested, The Wall as a movie is worth the watch, even if it is the version of this project that goes most into "Gorsh, we really do be living in a society, though" territory. As a full-blown media franchise, The Wall is an unquestionable achievement, but it's also the kind of work that brings with it a heavy cost. In this case, this album was the start of a years-long process that would effectively destroy the band. As I mentioned before, the band went out on a lavish arena tour to promote The Wall for good chunks of 1980 and 1981. A live album called Is There Anyone Out There was eventually released in the early 2000s, though it's not available on any streaming services. Plus, there was the aforementioned 1982 film. Speaking of the film, Roger Waters initially planned for a separate album to be its soundtrack, which would have been comprised of leftover tracks from the Wall sessions, plus a few new songs. However, Britain's role in the Falkland War led Waters to pivot and write even more new material. Once again, tensions were quite high during these sessions. Gilmour wanted to move away from the politics, Waters thought Gilmour wasn't writing enough music, Nick Mason was just left to make little sounds. Also on deck for this one was composer Michael Kamen, who worked on the Wall movie and would go on to work on films like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, and The Iron Giant. The final cut was released in March 1983. Remember how I said The Wall was thematically a Roger Waters solo album? Well, the final cut is just a Roger Waters solo album. The last two albums could be angry, but the final cut is pained. Roger Waters could be personal on past albums, this one feels like a therapy session at times. On one hand, the strongest moments on here rival those on The Wall, that scream in the gunner's dream, which is actually part of a follow-up story focusing on one of the teachers from Another Brick in the Wall, the piano on Paranoid Eyes, the title track. There's also When the Tigers Broke Free, which was in the Wall film, but got put on here. I'm thankful it got an official release because it's a really beautiful and emotional song about Waters losing his father in the war. In its lesser moments though, it can definitely feel like a Wall B-sides record. Reviews of this one were fairly mixed at the time, Gilmour has outright said he doesn't like it, but I gotta say, it's not too bad, and it shows Waters still had great ideas after making a Mongo-Chongo album like The Wall. That said, to call it a Pink Floyd album would feel disingenuous. It's a Roger Waters album featuring the members of Pink Floyd. I think that's in part why the final cut is also the group's first album in a while that feels like a retread instead of a forward progression. They would need to shake things up for their next album. So what did they do? Lawsuits! The years after the final cut were dedicated to the band's solo projects. David Gilmour's second album, Nick Mason's second album, Roger Waters' first album. That last record, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, was actually the second concept Roger presented to the band right before they began work on The Wall. It was after Hitchhiking that Roger Waters announced that Pink Floyd was done, which was news to everyone, including Gilmour and Mason. What followed was a whole mess of legal affairs, with EMI threatening to sue Waters for breach of contract, and Waters attempting to veto said lawsuit and prevent Pink Floyd from continuing to exist. That didn't work out, so Waters went his own way, leaving the Pink Floyd name to Gilmour and Mason. But Waters was able to walk away with the conceptual rights to The Wall, which is why the adaptations and tours in the years since are credited to Waters specifically. Sessions for the first Pink Floyd album without Waters were less tense, which let the gang do way more experimentation than on past records. Drum machines, MIDI, they even thought about having Gilmour rap. That said, the atmosphere of these sessions could often feel more dismal. Gilmour and Mason found it hard to write music without Waters, instead choosing to bring in outside songwriters. Though on a positive note, Bob Ezrin came back to produce, Storm Thorgerson from Hypnosis did the album artwork, and Richard Wright came back on keys, though for legal reasons he had to be hired on as a session musician. With an environment that could be quite dour and gloomy, you might start to think a new Pink Floyd album wouldn't be worth the trouble. You might even call its creation a momentary lapse of reason. And so did the band! A Momentary Lapse of Reason was released in September 1987. So after a pair of what were effectively Roger Waters' solo albums, what is this one like? Well, it's basically a David Gilmour solo album. A good chunk of the material on here was initially meant for Gilmour's next solo album, and he later decided to rework it into a Pink Floyd album. In fact, the biggest criticism you'll see levied against this one is that it doesn't sound a damn thing like Pink Floyd. But I'll push back on that slightly. I think it does sound like Pink Floyd. It's just a really dated version of Pink Floyd. The band's final album of the 80s is the most 80s sounding thing in their whole catalog. On one hand, the lean towards modern production does inspire some interesting takes on the Pink Floyd sound. I like One Slip, for example, the ambient yet percussive opening, segueing into the massive sounding drums. Terminal Frost is a pretty good instrumental, even though, according to my research, it's hated by a lot of people. But man, I can't hate on those rich guitars and that sax solo. Lead single Learning to Fly is pretty fine too, though though it feels radio-friendly in a way that no Pink Floyd single has felt before. Not that being radio-friendly is bad by any means, but for Pink Floyd it just struck me as off. But on the other hand, the production can lead to the most derivative tracks the band has ever made. The Dogs of War reminds me of the blues they were writing on Wish You Were Here and Animals, but something about the vocal processing and drum sounds makes it come off as obscenely corny. Yet Another Movie strikes me as a blatant ripoff of Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight, and while I did like Terminal Frost, I don't know why it's between A New Machine Parts 1 and 2, two interludes that add absolutely nothing to the pace of the album. I should also mention that one of the largest shifts between the final cut and this is Roger Waters' missed presence as a lyricist. As a guitarist and musician, David Gilmour is great. As a lyricist, he is. In fact, it's interesting to see the pendulum swing so wildly from Waters' brazen emotional honesty on the final cut to Gilmour's technically proficient, if a bit cold, demeanor on this. You know what this album reminds me of? David Bowie's Never Let Me Down. They're both records that push for modern production, but end up losing part of what makes their respective artists so special. They're also records that got remixes in the late 2010s. In the later years box set released in 2019, they included a new version of Momentary Lapse of Reason. The biggest change was all the drum parts being re-recorded by Mason, who had expressed disappointment in the original album's percussion. Like Never Let Me Down 2018, this new version won't change your opinion of the album, but it's an interesting compliment. So in total, A Momentary Lapse of Reason is not what its title would have you believe. Sure, the band were feeling creatively and legally burnt out, but it could have been worse. David Gilmour could have rapped on it. Pink Floyd did 2 rounds of tours between 1987 and 1989. They eventually got back to writing songs in 1993. The recording sessions, compared to the final cut and Momentary Lapse, were easygoing and, dare I say, enjoyable? Not having to deal with lawsuits will do that to you. Along with the returning Richard Wright and Bob Ezrin, the gang also brought in Gilmour's then-girlfriend, Polly Sampson, to help with lyrics. With a more hospitable recording environment, the group wrote a ton of songs for this new album, with a good chunk of them being left on the cutting room floor. I hope we get to hear them at some point. Yes, I can finally add a new sentence to my list of things that I'll never regret saying. The Division Bell was released in March 1994, a year when the big bands were singing about needing to be themselves and all the people. In contrast to the Britpop of the time, the Division Bell is lush and immaculately recorded, showing the band and associated personnel as true studio artisans. There's just one issue though. Past Pink Floyd albums could also be lush and immaculately recorded, but the best ones also had an emotional punch to them, and therein lies the weakness of the Division Bell. It just kinda happens. I mean, you put it on, you enjoy it in the moment, and when you finish listening, you're left with a feeling of, okay, that happened. The album's at its best when the songs manage to nail some kind of emotional and dynamic contrast. Pulls Apart, What Do You Want From Me, the very U2 sounding Take It Back, even Single High Hopes, which is one of the more divisive cuts in the band's catalog. But there's only so many times you can hear David Gilmour solo over hazy keys and synths before you think to yourself, yeah, I get it. As an example, I guess Marooned does evoke the feeling of being marooned either literally or metaphorically, but it's also a pale imitation of past Pink Floyd instrumentals. It's also the only Pink Floyd song to win a Grammy, so there's that. If there's one unabashedly good thing about the Division Bell though, it's Richard Wright's increased presence. In his book about the band, Nick Mason noted how Rick felt way more involved in the music-making process on here. And considering how much he had endured since The Wall, I'm glad he got to take on more of a role. The Division Bell is often viewed as the black sheep in Pink Floyd's discography, which I get to some degree. Still, I think these guys were too far along in their careers to make something truly bad. It's just in a similar camp as Momentary Lapse of Reason. It's fine for what it is, even if it's a far, far cry from what they had done before. Pink Floyd did one more tour following the Division Bell, with their last performance being in October 1994. While each member pursued personal projects, the next 10 years were radio silent for the band as an entity, but that silence was ended in 2005 when Pink Floyd with Waters performed at Live 8. which was organized by Bob Geldof. Look at that. From all reports, it was a good show. They even hugged at the end. Aww. That performance got a lot of people excited for a potential reunion or new tour, an excitement that Waters and Gilmour very quickly shut down. Aside from what would be their last performance together, this hiatus was most notable for the losses the band suffered. Syd Barrett passed away in July 2006, and Richard Wright passed in September 2008. It would seem like after losing two members of the group who were crucial in their own unique ways, that this would be the end of Pink Floyd. But 4 years after Wright's death, David Gilmour and Nick Mason went back into the studio for one last Pink Floyd album. So remember how I mentioned the Division Bell sessions yielded a lot of music that was never released? Well, the inspiration for this new project was to take those unreleased songs, rework them, add new parts, and make an album dedicated to Richard Wright. His own Wish You Were Here, as it were. In fall of 2014, Pink Floyd announced The Endless River, which was released later that year in November. To say people were excited for this one would be an understatement. I mean, how could they not be? It was a brand new Pink Floyd album, the first one in 20 years, and according to Gilmour, it would be their last. I think it's great that the band not only got to make a proper ending to their history, but do so while honoring an important and at times mistreated member of said history. But with that in mind, Gilmour explicitly said this album was not for the iTunes downloading generation, and he's absolutely right. The Endless River is comprised of 4 ambient pieces, with vocals only appearing at the end on lead single Louder Than Words. Wait, did they do that on purpose? In a sense, this album is a spiritual successor to the Division Bell, to the point where it gets its title from High Hopes. And just like the Division Bell, this one also just kinda happens. Which doesn't mean it's bad, there are certainly moments of beauty, and the entire thing sounds excellent. Nick Mason's drumming shines on tracks like Skins, Gilmour's soloing is technically sound, and it's easy to get swept up in the emotion of Anicia, Alan Z 1 and 2, and the aforementioned Louder Than Words. But there's no way I would recommend this entire album to anyone outside of the most devoted Pink Floyd fans. Again, I want to stress, I am glad Gilmour and Mason got to write their own ending for the band while paying tribute to a dear friend and partner. But The Endless River isn't a grand closing statement in the vein of final records I've covered before, like Black Star or We Got It From Here. It's a simple period. It's a nice period, perfectly circular and written with a fancy ballpoint pen, but it's still just a period.
Was wonderful. Good time was had by all. I'm pooped.
So is there any chance of another Pink Floyd reunion?
No.
Both Waters and Gilmour have flat out stated that a reunion is the last thing they'd want to do. In fact, one of the more recent bits of news about Pink Floyd was a dispute over who owned the band's website. I truly doubt that the entity known as Pink Floyd will ever perform again. But still, they've given us a pretty wild body of work, and even if you're not a fan of their early psych rock days or the work they put out amidst personal and legal turmoil, they did manage to give us 4 stone-cold classics of their time. If you want to get into Pink Floyd, I'd say start out with Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals. For a taste of their early days, I would say Atom Heart Mother and Meddle, and for their later days, probably The Final Cut and A Momentary Lapse of Reason. I'd also recommend Piper at the Gates of Dawn and The Wall, but with the qualifiers that the former is radically different from everything that would come after, and the latter is just a very heavy emotional experience and not the first album you should check out. And if you have a favorite Pink Floyd song, album, live performance, or related thing, I would love to know what it is in the comments.